All right. Thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for showing up for this last session of last year's VAMP. This is a bit of an overspill of the summer sessions, even though we're deep into the fall semester here at Vanderbilt. I am very grateful for all that we've been able to do this year. I'm very grateful to all the speakers that we've had this year. This, as you know, this was our inaugural series, and I'm very pleased to report that we were able to create this community online during the pandemic, and I'm very happy that you were all able to connect today. So today, our speaker, I am very, very pleased to introduce Kimyoung Kim from Freie Universitat Berlin. He is a friend and a scholar of Spinozian ascent. He is right now finishing his PhD in Berlin. And yeah, I mean, without further ado, his talk is entitled Spinoza's Ethics, Inadequate Individuation and Adequate Individuation. So let's give him a hand.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to present my paper. Thank you for all organizers, and thank you for audience today. I will share my screen. I have a wonderful PowerPoint now. You all can see the next page and third page, okay? Yeah, great. So I will notice before that it's a work in progress and part of a larger project. So I welcome any question and any comments for that. And I'm not an English or I'm currently doing PhD in Germany, but I'm not a German or English native speaker. So please be patient of my talk and some bumpy sentences in my paper. Okay, let's start. The title is Spinoza's Ethics, Inadequate Individuation and Adequate Individuation. Since Alexandre Matron's groundbreaking work, Individual and Community in Spinoza, was in 1968, the problematization of individual has become an established subject in Spinoza studies. However, this does not mean that there is one single generalized view among scholars of what Spinoza's concept of individuality looked like. There is still a wide array of discussions among scholars in which different views on individuality have led to different, sometimes completely antithetical conclusions. One noteworthy example of this is the debate on the individuality of the human collective, such as the state. There are, on the one hand, humanist or individualist readers of Spinoza, like McShaw or Will, Rice, and Renz recently, who claim that the state does not possess individuality in a genuine and authentic sense like human beings, and that only the latter, like human beings, can be the subject of its individual behavior and cognition. But then will, for example, the civitas, the state, is not an individual, but quote unquote, an organized set of relations. On the other hand, there are materialist or trans-individualist readers like Materon, Baliba, Jason Reed, and some Korean philosophers as well, Jin Tae-won and Kim Eun-ju, who again, to go quickly, tend to affirm the state as an individual with the same logic applied to human individuals, because the humans too are nothing but quote-unquote organized sets of relations, or as Baliba would say, trans-individuals. This discrepancy among Spinoza scholars revolves around the interpretation of the physical doctrines in ethics. For many individualists, the individuality of the whole of nature or of whatever else bigger than human individuals is a metaphorical one, which is why they prefer terms like supra-individual or sub-individual or pseudo-individual. The trans-individualists, in turn, read notions of the individual in ethics literally and find the universal principle of individuation applicable from the quantum level individuals to the whole universe, emphasizing the dynamics and heterogeneity of individuality. There are indeed many other battlegrounds with different understandings of individuality and individuation in Spinoza studies. For example, the debate on consciousness, panpsychism, parallelism, social contract theory, etc. But to address them all is beyond the scope of this paper. Instead, I'll focus on refining the trans-individualist reading of Spinoza by illuminating the intimate connection between the ontology of individuation and epistemology of different kind of knowledge in the ethics. And before that, I'll notice that I think that we can never understand Spinozism if not abandoning the image of the body proper. I mean, a singular discrete unit continued from its birth to its destruction. It is for Spinoza just an imaginary, the body proper. That means if I conceive things like stone, pen, or even myself as the stone, pen of myself, then I fall into inadequacy, where I consider those things like substances, not mores. On this subject, however, I will discuss, I'll take another occasion. So in the first section, I provide a pair of general interpretative principles applicable to any individuation-related subject in Spinoza studies. These principles, which I call externalization or external partition, and internalization or internal partition. These principles are to be derived particularly from Spinoza's mereological theory of individuation, crystallized in EP 32, the letter 32, and E2P 11c, the corollary of the proposition 11 of the has been strangely overlooked in Spinoza studies, despite its crucial role in the whole following argument in the ethics. In section 2, I apply the principles of individuation to explain inadequate knowledge, imagination and passion or affects, and adequate knowledge, reason or common notion, or virtue. In section 3, the conclusion, I explain Spinoza's concept of passivity and activity with these principles. By doing this, I will insist that what he calls imagination and passivity refers to inadequate individuation, and what he calls reason and activity to adequate individuation. So now I'll go over two principles of individuation. Let us look into E2P 11c first, which is followed by a strange warning in the scholium next to the corollary. I quote, "Here no doubt my readers will come to a halt and think of many things which will give them pause. For this reason, I ask them to continue on with me slowly, step by step, and to make no judgment on these matters until they have read through them all." End of quote. This warning intimates that the corollary is not simply one of many corollaries or propositions within the ethics. I will show in the following that it is the corollary which offers the key to understanding the breadth and depth of the theory of individuation and knowledge in the whole ethics. So now I quote E2P 11c. with some letters added by myself. I quote, "From this it follows that the human mind is a part of the infinite intellect of God. Therefore, when you say that the human mind perceives this or that, we are saying nothing but that God, not insofar as he is infinite, but insofar as he is explained through the nature of the human mind, X, or insofar as he constitutes the essence of the human mind X, has this or that idea, A. And when you say that God has this or that idea, A prime, not only insofar as he constitutes the nature of the human mind X, but insofar as he also has the idea of another thing, Y, together with the human mind X. Then we say that the human mind perceives the thing only partially or inadequately. Oh, sorry. In this corollary, we see, first of all, that for Spinoza, the problem of individuation is one of mereology. That is the relationship between a whole and its part. An individual idea or mind is a part of the infinite mind. This is not too difficult to comprehend when you consider the definition of God, the definition 6 of the ethics, and the proposition on the production of modes according to the necessity of the nature of God, the proposition 16 of the first book. All ideas and minds are necessarily part of God's intellect. But how then do finitude, contingency, and extermination in nature take place? How can we come to conceive this or that particular thing as an individual, as a particular individual? These questions may find their answers in Utopia 11c. According to this corollary, there are two ways of partition which are described by two insofar clauses, in Latin quatenus. The first case is, I quote, insofar as God constitutes the essence of the human mind, X has this or that idea, A. What exactly this means can be grasped whether by the second insofar. That is, I quote, God has this or that idea, A prime, insofar as he has, together with the human mind, X, also the idea of another thing, Y. Spinoza adds that inadequate ideas in the human mind emerge only from the second case, so that we can see that what at stake here is a contrast between adequate necessary individuation and inadequate accidental individuation of finite things. What constitutes the antithesis between these two quatenus clauses? It is another thing, the external thing, that does not appear in the first case, but only in the second case. In the first quatenus, the being of the external things is excluded. There is only one human mind, X, like in the world, whose essence is a modification of God. In the second case, however, there is not only the mind X, but also another individual Y, where the other is presumed to likewise be a modification of God, but distinct from that of X. Let's take a closer look at both cases. In the first case, the first image, in the first case, what is thought by the mind X, an idea A, must be nothing other than the self-recognition of X, given that there is no other thing outside of X. There is no external partition between the mind X and the idea A. So the idea A is an, in my word, internal part of X, where the negation of A's being leads to the destruction of the whole of X. In the second case, however, this integrality is not possible. For the idea A prime is not only understood from the essence of X, but also from the essence of Y, because God has the idea A prime so long as God thinks both X and Y. It is noteworthy that Spinoza described the idea A prime here in such a way so that the mind X, I quote, perceives the thing Y only partially, in other words, inadequately, end of quote. From this, we may conclude that the idea A prime is the idea of the external individual Y in the mind X. But we have not yet arrived at the true antithesis in E2P11C that would lead the readers to despair, which was Spinoza's worry in the showroom. Only when you see what the idea A in the first case can be reinterpreted from the conclusion of the second case, that is from the partial nature of the idea A prime and the externality of the individual Y, can you arrive at what Spinoza attempts to articulate as the antithesis of both cases in this corollary. What does that mean? Now let us assume that there are X and Y in the first case, not in the second case. So there are X and Y in this world, but in a very different way to the second case. It is very tricky, so just see the third image. The idea A in third case, unlike the partial idea A prime in the second case, is an adequate and perfect idea of Y in the mind X. And that means that the individual Y is now internal or integral part of X. There is therefore no external partition between X and Y more, but an internal partition or internalization. I might also ask you, as Spinoza did, to continue on with me slowly, step by step, and to make no judgment on these matters until you have heard through them all. But for now, I need to only point out that Spinoza's theory of the first and second kind of knowledge, namely inadequate and adequate knowledge, and particularly of the common notions, which is the source of the reason, and also of activity and passivity. That means almost everything in the ethics are based on the principles of individuation introduced in this corollary. I mean, externalization and internalization. So let's go over the less difficult part, the case of EP32. To my view, this letter offers a bottom-up description of E2P11C. According to Spinoza's theory of union of mind and body, so-called parallelism, mind and body are one and the same individual between which only a rational or conceptual distinction is possible. This means that everything that happens in the mind must also happen in the body. The fact that in E2P11C, the mind X and Y are individuated sometimes as one individual, sometimes as one mind X, and sometimes as two externally divided minds X and Y, should also be explained physically in such a way that the bodies X and Y are sometimes a single body X and sometimes two divided bodies X and Y. The two modes of the individuation do not necessarily have to take place in different or even mutually exclusive temporal moments, but may also occur at the same moment. In EP32, I think it's the letter to Oldenburg, Spinoza demonstrates this fact with an interesting example of a worm in blood. I quote, "Since, for example, the movements of the parts of the limb, of the chyle, etc., are adapted to one another according to their size and shape, so that they are in perfect agreement among themselves and all at the same time constitute a liquid. In this respect, only chyle, limb, etc. are regarded as parts of the blood. But if we imagine that the limb particles are different from the chyle particles in their shape and movement, in this respect, we regard them as a whole, not as parts. Let us suppose, for instance, that there lives in the blood a worm which is gifted with sight to distinguish the particles of the blood, of the limb, etc., and with reason to observe how each particle, when colliding with another, either bounces back or tells the latter a part of its own motion, etc. this worm would always live in the blood, as we do in this part of the universe. And it would consider its particle of blood as a whole, but not as one part, and would not be able to know how all parts are governed by the common nature of the blood, and would be forced to adapt to each other, as the common nature of the blood requires in order to agree with each other in some way. As the example of blood particles, and worms demonstrate, each body is at once a separate whole and a part of a larger whole. There are here two quaternions again. The first one, insofar as the movement of the parts adapt to each other according to their size and shape and are in perfect agreement with each other. The second one, insofar as a part imagines, in this case gifted with sight, that itself is different in shape and movement from other blood particles and the blood as a whole. Thus, the worm as a whole, facing the other blood particles, sees its movement as its own movement, different from the movements of the others. While the first corresponds to the internal partition in E2P 11c, insofar as God's intellect is the essence of the mind of the blood, the second is equivalent to the external partition in E2P 11c. Insofar as God perceives not only the mind of the blood, but also that of the worm. One might then wonder, does the worm just imagine its own individuality as a wholeness? Does it then contradict the theory of mind-body union or parallelism? My answer is no. Because the distinction which Spinoza speaks of here is not a purely mental cognition, but rather a difference of body movements of the worm in each of the two cases. On the one hand, the worm moves in the same way as the other bodies. On the other hand, it has its own movement to which it is externally determined by the other bodies. In this example, seeing. Seeing is also a bodily movement. The idea in which it sees itself as a whole arises from certain movements of the body, that is, the visual affection from the others, and vice versa. Thus, the worm recognizes both its body and the other bodies, as well as the whole blood, only partially, while by becoming affected, it externalizes itself to a certain extent from the whole mechanism of its movement and their correspondence with the whole. The state of mind that arises with such externalizing affection is the first kind of knowledge, imaginatio. With the imagination, along with the imagination, a body actually behaves as a whole, a discrete individual, a body profile. So it's not merely ideal or illusory at all. So section 2, imagination as inadequate individuation and reason as adequate individuation. I first go over the problem of externalization and imagination. While we perceive a given thing as an object, our body is externalized by this thing and affected by this external cause. Thus, the idea we have of the external thing, I quote, rather demonstrates the state of our body, end of quote. Even if the external thing ceases to exist, our mind may still have the idea of this, the very external thing, because it is in fact an idea of the affected state of our body. It's the memory or imagination. Even more striking is that the mind has partial as well as inadequate ideas, not only of external things, but also of the parts of its own body, insofar as they are presented in the same way as objects. This is due to the fact that they are actually externalized from the body, and each behaves as a whole individual. I quote, that's E2P 24 demonstration. The parts composing the human body pertain to the essence of the body itself only insofar as they communicate their emotions to one another in a certain fixed manner, and not insofar as they can be considered as individual without relation to the human body. For the parts of the human body are highly composite individuals whose parts can be separated from the human body and communicate their emotions to other bodies in another manner, while the human body completely preserves in its nature and form. This demonstration offers a more theoretical insight into the example of the worm in blood in EP 32. The correspondence of the part with the whole and its separation from the whole do not necessarily represent two mutually exclusive facts, such as I'm like first as parts and then a separate individual. Not in this way. Rather, again, two instances of quaternions distinguish the two realities at once and at one and the same time. Internalization on the one hand, like insofar as they communicate their emotions to one another in a certain fixed manner, yeah. And externalization on the other hand, insofar as they can be considered as individuals without relation to the human body. Our mind and body, in the imagining of external things, its own body parts, and finally its own body itself, come into a contingent existence whose fate depends on external causes. The mind of our body only partially, that is inadequately, recognizes the necessary mechanism of its existence, its ratio of motion and rest. The power of the body, potentia, is sometimes increased and sometimes decreased by external bodies, and with it, the mental faculty, potentia cognitandi, passes to sometimes a greater and sometimes a lesser perfection. From these passive transitions of body and mind are formed the effects of joy and sadness. Regardless of whether the individual moves to a greater perfection or to a lesser perfection, it does not escape from the inadequacy, that is, separation from external individuals, and even more, separation from itself as an external thing. In this respect, an individual can never live in his or her own nature and power. I quote, "It is impossible that man is not part of nature and that he can only suffer changes that can be understood from his nature alone and whose adequate cause is himself." End of quote. Accordingly, in the Political Treatise, Spinoza expresses such a dismissive view of the political fate of the man who is regarded as single and independent. I quote, "The natural right of man, as long as it is determined by the power of an individual and that individual is a self-sufficient individual, is logically as good as nothing. It consists more in fantasy than in reality, for it lacks any certainty of being its own." So Spinoza, in this regard, very anti-individualist, unlike the modern concept of the individual in Western. So now I'll go over internalization and reason. Inadequacy alone, however, does not represent the whole picture of transindividuality. Ironically, in order to be within his own power, to be virtuous, an individual must never be independent and remain in his own imagined externalized identity. Instead, the individual still needs other external things, but this time in a completely different, adequate way. The adequation, the rational way of becoming different, arises from the internalization of the external with itself, or as expressed in Spinoza's word, agreement. As we can see in EP 32 and in E2P 24D, Spinoza links the word agreement to being part of a body. A body as an independent individual can never be in agreement with other bodies. A body, on the other hand, can only be in agreement with the other bodies insofar as it adapts its movement to those of the other parts. Spinoza elaborates upon this in his theory of common notions and activity. The concept of common notion first appears in E2P 29s after Spinoza described the fate of individuals lapsed into contingency, inadequacy, and externality. So I quote P29s, I say expressly that the mind has not an adequate, but only a confused knowledge of itself, of its own body, and of external bodies, so long as it perceives things from the common order of nature. That is, so long as it is determined externally from fortuitous encounters with things to regard this or that, not so long as it's determined internally from the fact that it regards numbers of things at once to understand their agreements, differences, and oppositions. For so often as it is disposed internally, and this will not be things clearly and distinctly, as I shall show below. End of quote. It is here that Spinoza finally introduces the pair of terms which he has already hinted at in E2P 11c, externality and internality. A quote-unquote clear and distinct, and therefore no longer accidental idea of things is brought about when the mind regards things at once and understands their agreement, differences, and oppositions. It is this that Spinoza calls the internal disposition of the mind. It is striking that here he mentions not only the agreement of things, but also of differences and oppositions as that which is to be understood. This suggests that the integrity and necessity of a single mind, as it is a process of dealing with differences and even antagonisms among the individuals or among parts. A process of transforming exteriority into interiority. The question to be raised here would be what this process then means for corporeal reality, which should not be different from mental reality. In E2P 38 and 39, Spinoza offers an insight into how the externality of the relationship of individuals is transformed into internality. I quote 38, those things which are common to all and which are equally in the part and in the whole can only be conceived adequately. And P 39, if something is common to and peculiar to the human body and certain external bodies, by which the human body is usually affected, and is equally in the part and in the whole of each of them, its idea will also be adequate in the mind. So in the former, it is about the idea of what which is common to all and which are equally in the part and in the whole. In the latter, it is about the idea of that which is common to and particular to the human body and certain external bodies by which the human body is usually affected. In the demonstration of the two propositions, Spinoza refers to E2P 11c as I mentioned above. First, the P38 demonstration, I quote, the mind therefore, according to E2P 11c, necessarily perceives A is which is common to all and equal in the part in the whole, adequately, and does so both insofar as it perceives itself and insofar as it is perceived its own or any external body, nor can A be conceived in another way. Then 39d. There will be an adequate idea of A in God, both insofar as he has the idea of the human body and insofar as he has ideas of the posited external bodies. Let it be posited now that the human body is affected by an external body through what it has in common with it, that is by A. The idea of this affection will involve property A, and so the idea of this affection insofar as it involves property A, will be adequate in God insofar as he is affected with the idea of the human body, that is, insofar as he constitutes the nature of the human mind. And so according to P11C, this idea is also adequate in the human mind. In both cases, there appear expressions such as external bodies, which in P11C were actually considered the source of inadequacy, but now no longer. According to P11C, an adequate perception is, as said, only possible insofar as God is explained by the nature of the human mind. So in relation to P38D, this means that now the finite individual mind also perceives external bodies in the same way as it perceives itself and its own body, namely, insofar as what is common to all and is equal in the part and the whole is at stake. It is the mind, namely, that internalizes the mind of external bodies into its own nature in the same way the body internalizes external bodies into its own nature. In P38 corollary, between the 38 and 39, Spinoza clarifies his notion of the common, which must be perceived adequately or clearly and distinctly, and that is, all bodies agree in that they can move now more slowly, now more quickly, and absolutely they move, now they are at rest. Indeed, the common notion is in the mere matter of fact that all physical beings are in the attribute of extension, and that means they are all in certain propositions of movement without exception. So in P39D, the mechanism of internalization is illustrated more concretely. Spinoza points to a property A that is common to both the human body and the external body, and notes that there is an adequate idea of A in God, I quote, both insofar as he has the idea of the human body and insofar as he has the ideas of those external bodies. According to P11C, the human mind in such a case would have only an inadequate externalized idea of A. However, the common property significantly changes this situation. So let's think of the third image that I showed earlier. At the end of the P39D, the mind of the human mind perceives the idea of A only adequately. That means, again, from P11C, the idea of A is adequate in God insofar as God constitutes the nature of the human mind. In order to reconcile the two statements, there is just one condition. The human body is affected by the external body through a common property. What property would be considered common in this case? We should be careful not to take as accidental encounter this kind of affection being affected. In and after which the human body remains the human body and the external body, the external body. Is not the case. In recalling P38C, the corollary, as I stated above, we should first limit ourselves by the understanding that Spinoza's notion of the common strictly refers to a common proportion of motion and rest. Here, however, it is no longer the most universally common as in P38C, so everything moves or in rest, but a specific commonness, but very particular commonness between the bodies in the context of their concrete affection being affected. The common property is thus not a property that is already given, or a structure or nomological architecture as scholars like Andreas Giacomo assert. The property is not already given or before and after the encounter, and that can be considered independent of the affection. The property, in contrast, is that which is only produced in and through encounter and affection, or in and through common movement. From this, we should be able to conclude that the affection referred to in 39D is a mutual internalization of the external body and of the human body through their common movement. So in it, a new individual is emerged, but its nature can only be represented by the nature of the human body alone, because it paradoxically expresses not the separate, independent nature of the human body, but their common nature. The external body is now an internal part of the human body, and vice versa. The human body is an internal part of the no longer external body. It is only in such a relation of becoming common that the mind has an adequate idea of itself, of the no longer external individual, and of their becoming common, because there is no negation in this relation, which can represent the boundary of the individual mind and its passivity. Only in this way, Spinoza calls this faculty of internalizing individuation reason is not a faculty of a separate individual independent of his, always the faculty of participation, of mental aggrandizement. I quote, "From this it follows that the mind is more capable of perceiving many things adequately as its body has many things in common with other bodies." Reason for Spinoza is nothing but a practical reason that exists only in its actual situated inaction. A knowledge of external object of any kind, even if it includes correct information about them, is still for Spinoza an inadequate idea, an imagination. Whether we perceive our distance from the sun as 200 feet or correctly recognize it as 148.46 million kilometers, we are merely in various degrees of inadequacy, insofar as the sun par excellence stands as an object, external object to us. Reason, the faculty of adequation, is instead always an actual faculty of becoming common of bodies, of becoming an internal part of a greater individual, where its nature is eventually not different to ours. In E4P 49, in my view, we find a possibility of coexistence and simultaneity of the different kinds of knowledge and individualities in one and the same individual, in the same moment. I quote, "To every action to which we are determined from an effect which is a passion, we can be determined by reason without that effect." I think it is striking that Spinoza himself gives as an example of rational knowledge, quote unquote, the act of beating, whereby a person raises his arm, closes his fist, and moves his whole arm forcefully up and down. It's a reasonable act for Spinoza in certain sense. Spinoza argues that insofar as the act of beating is considered physically, it is virtue. The virtue in the ethics is nothing but acting guided by reason. At this level of individuation, certain parts of this person's body operates in a certain common relationship of motion and rest in order to make the act of beating. However, his body is also an external part of the whole nature at the same time. Therefore, in another level of individuation, there is someone else, for example, a person with a very aggressive facial expression or voice. He sees or hears this external individual, that is, his body is affected by the external individual, and his mind forms a partial and inadequate idea of this affection of his body. which includes both the essence of his body and that of the external individual, a person with aggressive behavior, namely the image of the external individual. At this level, the act of beating is explained by the hate or anger related to this image. I quote, "If a man moved by anger or hate is determined to close his fist or move his arm, that happens because one and the same action can be joined to any images of things whatever." So now my conclusion. Spinoza's concept of mode or modal distinction always includes the two realities at once, which is equally true for any local level of individuation, from a quantum level to the whole universe. Through externalization, a finite individual exists and operates as a separate part of a larger individual having inadequate knowledge of itself, external individuals, while through internalization, it is an internal and integral part of a larger individual, having adequate knowledge of itself and the whole. However, one should not say that the form includes within itself a falsity, unreality, or negativity. Equally actual, real, necessary. That in the former, externalization, the whole necessary reality of the given causal relation is represented only partially, wherein the individual suffers negations and determinations by external things, not within itself, and is consequently called accidental. That is the definition of passivity. While the latter, in internalization, the latter indicates the full causal reality by transforming the external into its internal parts, and it thereby, with the common notions, reasonably participates in a larger individuation, and that is activity. Within the internalization, or becoming common, the affections of externalized individuals are finally understood completely and find their use for reason and activity. So I quote, "So long as we are not torn by effects contrary to our nature or external to our nature, we have the power of ordering and connecting the affections of the body according to the order of the intellect." End of quote. And I think it's not just a human faculty. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you for all.
Thank you so much, Kim. This was such a brilliant talk, and I would like to talk about this for several hours. So I'm gonna put myself at the very end of the queue before I start getting all talky. I see that we already have one question. Before I give Siliang the floor, I wanted to invite you all. You can either type your questions in the chat if you're not comfortable or you're not in a situation where you can read them out loud, or you can just raise your hand or type question in the chat, and I'll just call on you, and we'll go on like that. All right, so first question, Siliang.
Hello, thank you. Well, I saw all kinds of hands raised, but they were actually applauses. So I rushed putting my hand there thinking, oh, I won't have time to have my question before the end of the discussion. But then I realized I'm first. Okay, all good. I loved your paper. Thank you very much for this very insightful suggestion of linking individuality with inadequate and adequate types of cognition. That's very exciting. I have a couple of questions, and I would like you to share your screen again, coming to a couple of slides. And I don't want to mobilize the whole floor of questions, but I do have 3 or 4 particular questions. So if you can bring out your PowerPoint again, I would love to ask you. One thing in particular was in your second part, It was a slide called externalization and imagination. The one quoting definition to proposition 13. It was the beginning of that second part. I didn't look when you began. I think it was one of the first ones. You present something more or less like a quote. No. Okay, so move on. Yes, this one.
This one?
Okay.
That one?
Why do you have quotation marks there? That's my first. No, the slide before, please.
Okay.
Yes, this one. So I'm just wondering, what are those quotation marks relating to? Because they're clearly not a quote from Spinoza. So I was wondering if this, did I miss that it was part of a book? Is it, what is it? Because I may disagree with one of the things there.
I think it's a very quotation of Spinoza from the E2P24. It's a Spinoza text.
Yeah, I think it's a demonstration to proposition 24 of part 2.
Okay, so the reference there, the last reference is the right one. Okay, so I'm going to put it there. Well, then I'm going to ask you to explain to me the first yellow thing, and not insofar as they can be considered as individuals without relation to the human body. I wasn't sure what that meant. But okay, now I understand it is Spinoza's quote. I thought it was your own quote one way or another, and you were putting those things together. Now I understand I better just have to reread this by myself. Okay, let's leave it aside. I'll read it and understand it in the context. I have one more general question, not related to a slide, which is, all right for adequate type of knowledge, but what about the distinction between reason and intuition? Does that make any difference in the type of individuation that we may look at? Are you talking basically just about reason, or is what you say also applicable to intuition?
Right.
And I would have a possible criticism in your finishing remarks that reason can be understood only as practical reason only, in the sense that it's an active faculty of being part of a larger individual. Because reason is also clearly explained, notably in the second half of the ethics, as we know, through calculus, through very theoretical things. So when you say that it's a way of becoming part of a bigger whole, that makes sense for politics, that makes sense for sociability as being something including the body. But in terms of just theory or mind-related ideas, what kind of individual are we talking about? Why are we saying it's only a practical reason in that case? So this is it. Thank you.
Right.
So those two questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah. I think
and you can stop your PowerPoint sharing.
Yeah. Okay, about the very quotation from here. So I will share further my screen. Let's think of the blood worm, the worm in the blood. The blood worm lives in the blood. So in one sense, it is connected to other particles. And as a part, they all constitute the blood. But in other sense, the blood worm is also a separate thing in a certain kind of, in a certain sense. Like we human beings, we are all part of nature, internal part of nature. We are all part of the necessary order of nature. But we think us as an individual, discrete, independent individual. In this way, we can think of the parts of our body as well, like the hair or like my hands. If I see and perceive my hands, it is already an external thing from my body, from my mind. But if I, for example, writing something with my hands, my body consists of common movement with my hands, with the body of my hands in this way. So the concept of individual for Spinoza is not a substance like body proper, but it's a kind of multiplicity. It's kind of relation itself. So Etienne Balibar calls it trans-individual. Everything is very relational. So in this sense, we can see what is the reason, why I call the reason as only practical reason. So for the calculus, the body needs to be moving together. My nerves and my brains and my hands and muscles, everything have to be moving for a calculus, for a very complex calculus. The result is an imagination, even though it's an exact result. They are all imagination external to my body. But the movement, for this movement of body, this movement of body is the ground, the condition for reason, or the parallel to the reason in mind. So yeah, let's see. I think I'll answer to these questions. Yeah.
Yes, for the theory aspect, but what about the intuition aspect?
Right.
Precisely.
Sorry. I'm sorry about that. So actually, the title of my paper was the ethics and the individuation and the three kinds of knowledge, and I changed my title because of the time limit. I think this internalization scheme can be helpful to understand what the intuitive knowledge is, because the intuition is from the whole essence of God to the very singular essence. What does it mean? Everything in the nature is on the one hand internal part of the nature, internal part of the whole necessary order. At the same time, every individuals in the nature, the external part of the nature as a separate individuals. So imagined as a separate individuals. The bodies and the minds has all in every moment, in every level, two different types of individuation: externalization, external partition, or internal partition. So in this sense, as an internal partition, we can have or we can behave as God, because there is no difference between myself and God, insofar as we are only an internal part of God. So we can have an internal intuitive knowledge of God and the essence of myself and essence of other things, because our knowledge is not different from God's knowledge in this very specific sense. And I think that's the intuitive knowledge. But I'm not. It's not my final interpretation of intuitive knowledge. Maybe I have to read more about that issue.
Well, thank you very much. I think there definitely is something to continue in this direction for intuition. And I wonder if it's appropriate to do it, but I would like to share with you a paper I wrote on that topic of the I, which I am in myself, in my essence, versus the I, the me, as I am affected through my encounters with the external world. So I'll put it in the chat, and anyone interested can have a look at it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a queue forming. So first of all, I wanted to ask to Anna Beria if they feel satisfied with what's been said, because there was a question regarding eternity again. So if Anna has any follow-up, would be interested in hearing it.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm sorry I can't, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I can't turn on my video right now. Yes, I mean, I think you have touched on my question as well. I mean, I would like to hear more if you wanted to elaborate on that more. Like, my question was also about the third kind of knowledge, and how would it, do you think, so maybe what I still want to ask is, like, would you say it is in any way different from the second type of individuation that you talked about? Still, like, you answered it, I answered it a bit already, but maybe still you would say something about it, like, because of the original title of your talk, three kinds of knowledge as three kinds of individuation. I wonder if there is a, like, this third kind of individuation correspondent to third kind of knowledge is used in your idea in any way different from the second internalization mode that you talked about. Yeah, thank you so much. I wrote my question there as well, but so yeah, that's basically it.
I think the essential difference between reason and intuitive knowledge lies upon the eternity, the question of eternity, and that's very tricky one. I think for everyone, for every Spinoza scholars, and they have all different interpretation on the intuitive knowledge and blessedness. I think the reason, as practical reason, as a bodily action, activity, and virtue becoming common, whatever else you can call it, is still in the finite level. So local level, I mean. So when I'm riding my bike, the body of bike and the body of myself consist of one individual. So you can say, oh, the bicycle go further. And also, oh, the man is going further. It's all the same. That's the reason. Being able to riding bicycle at this very moment is one example of reasoning for Spinoza in my interpretation. They are all in local level. Even the state, for example, a state can remain in its form when all citizens are harmonically doing things together, etc., in a very ideal situation. Its duration is very long. It can be sometimes infinitely long, but it's not the eternity. Eternity is about form. The form of the things in the necessary nature of God. So in this sense, we are all, our essence in eternity is internal part of the whole nature's essence. That's, and to find this nature, to find this essence of myself, of other things, of other individuals, of the whole natures, and enjoying this find is the intuitive knowledge and blessedness and amor Dei intellectualis. So that's my interpretation, but you could read very differently. I think it is allowed to everyone, because even Spinoza scholars, the even most prominent Spinoza scholars have different minds about that issue.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's brilliant, and I'm going to follow up on it later. I'm just putting a note for myself in my head. Then I wanted to invite Alice to intervene.
Sorry, yes. Just a second. Let me see if I can turn on my camera. Yes. Hi, do you hear me well and see me? Hi, so thank you so much for your presentation. It was incredibly interesting. While you were making, so this is just a comment / ask for help, I guess, in better understanding, because when you were talking about the difference between internalization and externalization, which I think is very interesting that you focused on that. It just came to my mind the difference between immanent causation and transitive causation.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask if you think that externalization could be, I wouldn't say, identical to, but related to transitive causation, while internalization to immanent causation. And also I had a follow-up for Siliana's remark on reason, which I wrote in the chat because I didn't want to derail the conversation of your talk. So the one about reason as being not only practical, but also theoretical, which is, if we consider that ideas for Spinoza are actions of the mind, in the sense that they affirm or negate something, couldn't we also say that what we consider as theoretical reason is also practical in nature, insofar as affirming and negating our actions? So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the pair of immanent causation and transitive causation has slightly different focus to my externalization and internalization pair, because it's immanent causation is about the relationship between God and the modes, and it's the university of something like that. And if God's attribute is extension, then everybody is extended thing, because God is also extended thing in his attribute extension. So God is, in my word, God is moving infinitely. So we all move somehow in this nature. That's the meaning of immanent causation. Transitive causation is about the relationship between things, between modes. So it can be externalization and it can be also internalization. So if we make a commonness in this very causation, in this affection, I am, or for example, I with my clothes is now make a common body. So we are one individual. In this affection of doing things, wearing my clothes, is internalization in my example. But if I see or if I feel my clothes, oh, it's itching or something like that, then it is not anymore internalization. My clothes is external to my body. So we are two different bodies. So in the same moment, I can have two individualities at the same time, with my clothes or without my clothes, my mind as well. So I think it's a different problematization, a different subject. And about theoretical reasoning, I think what other philosophers can call theoretical reasoning or reason itself can be described very differently in Spinoza text. what people call reason is a kind of mixture of mixture of reasoning and imagination in Spinoza. So the very strict definition of reason for Spinoza is only practical reason in my interpretation. But the reasoning body, as I say, the reasoning body used in imaginations like books, letters, signs, or computer, laptops, etc. By doing this, we the acting body can have new knowledges and new imaginations, new imagined contents, like a book. I can write a book. I can make some complex machines if I am mechanics, etc. That's the very definition of reason for Spinoza. Acting body, doing things. But other people can say reason is a different thing. As we know, the highly reflexive, conscious mind, etc. But it's not Spinozan sense of our reason.
Thank you so much. Can I just make a briefly follow up, just very brief? So I just want to clarify why I thought of transitive and immanent causation. So as far as I understood, for example, externalization, I thought you were talking about, for example, let's say I consider myself as unrelated to the world around me upon which I act and which acts upon me, right? And so I live in a world of transitive causation, right? So I can detach myself of everything, even though I am affected and I affect everything I interact with. While on the other hand, I thought your internalization was about considering myself as part of the system, so to say, or the organism, whatever, in a sense that I fully comprehend at any given time that the effects I am affected by and the effects I produce on whatever I interact with are part of the system eternally, continually, and they are necessary because they follow from the necessary nature of God. So it might be that I misinterpreted your internal and external, but that's why I thought about it. But anyways, I thought it was very interesting, and thank you so much for the answers and your presentation.
Thank you. It sounds more precise, and yeah, I was thinking about that issue, immanent causation and transitive causation in relation to my interpretation. Right, that's very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so moving on, I think we have Rafael.
Hi, and thank you very much for the paper. It was amazing. Long time no see, Kimyoung. Hi there. I have a few questions regarding. Yeah, indeed. I have a few questions regarding the topic of the production of the common and its relation to the affects and affection. So I see like kind of a problem here because we have proposition number 57, the third part, where Spinoza says 57. 57, Spinoza says that each affect it differs from every individual according to the essence of such individual. So somehow what is common cannot be on that level because it goes even further in ethics number part 4, regarding specifically, excuse me a little bit, it was proposition number, excuse me, how is this? What's kind of a problem here? It was proposition number 29, Spinoza says any singular thing which nature is totally diverse, it doesn't say contrary, but diverse from ours, cannot either hinder or enact or act in power. So somehow the common has to be presupposed in order to produce affections among the individuals. So at the very end of your presentation, you said that somehow the common was a production of the affections between these encounters.
Right.
But it
Right.
seems that according to Spinoza's ontology or mereology of these sorts of dynamics of the finite, it kind of makes us consider an image of the world, which to me makes different things that have nothing in common to go parallel without any relation, and to be to enable encounters only with things that already have something in common, which is why under the guidance of reason, men can coincide in a single body. And here is ethics number part 4, proposition 35. So while I on the very broad level, I share your intuition that somehow state or civitas or different collective associations between men are possible to have an individual status. Somehow it presupposes something already common, a common soil by which they can be affected at the same, I don't know, level, but of the same or somehow shared way. Otherwise, their nature differs, which is something that already Spinoza says in proposition number 32, part 4. So I would like to see how is it that you think this possible production of the common after the affects, or perhaps I understood wrong the thesis. I don't know. That was all. Thank you very much. But otherwise, very good, and very nice to see you again.
Thank you. It's really nice to see you again. I recommend you to read Andrea Sangiacomo. I forgot the title of the book, but it's really interesting and different to my approach. But he says about the common nature, common property as a nomological structure of things like that. So in a particular interaction, there are two things which has similar or common nomological structure, and the bodily affection can be only adequately conceived only adequately, etc., etc. But it's very different to my approach, because I suggest that, yeah, everything is in common in the sense that we are all moving things. We are all moving bodies. So we are all ideas in thought. And in extension, we are all moving bodies. So just as God is moving, we are all moving. The difference is God is eternally moving, but we are all have just a finite duration of moving, or yeah. So and it expresses by Spinoza as the proportion of motion and rest. So everything has, even though very different, the proportion of motion and rest. In this sense, everything is common. And that's the reason we can make the concrete commonness at every level of interaction with each other. And only through this interaction, we produce the common proportion of motion and rest. That's my idea. And only through this, we can make common body and reasoning and virtue and activity. And when you think of a common property which remains before and after the interaction, I think we lost something. We think this property kind of like a substance. But everything is changing in Spinoza's world, I think. So that's why I suggest my own concept of commonness as a very actual producing of commonness. And one point I would like to share is it's not just about new question and about to everyone. Even though I say myself, etc., so from the perspective of the first person, Spinoza never used the first person perspective in his book. Descartes did, cogito ergo sum. But for Spinoza, there is only a third person perspective. So there is no first person perspective for Spinoza. So even though I say about me, myself, my expression, my reasoning, it's kind of non-Spinozistic idea. So Spinoza says only human mind, human things, or human is extended thing, etc. So that's, I think, important to understand this notion. And I'm a little bit secretly, I have been thinking of kind of Buddhist philosophy of anatma, so non-me or non-self, when reading Spinoza. So I find always in Spinoza's concept of individuation, there is nothing substantial in any individuals. There is always relationship between things. Only from the perspective of a relationship, the actual relations of things, we can have the adequate knowledge of Spinoza's metaphysics. And thank you for your questions. Yeah. There is a disparity between scholars, and I really kind of stands in an extreme pole. So I deny any kind of architectural or nomological structure. Well, I only go for the very movement, the motion and rest, the proportion of motion and rest at the very moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was, I mean, we still have some difference, but indeed it was a very nice answer. Thank you very much.
All right. So we technically only have 3 minutes left, but I will allow myself to ask one last question. I promise I'm going to keep it very brief if everybody is okay with that. So I don't know if you remember, I had a paper basically on the same lines, stressed with the same problems, how to connect individuality and epistemology in Spinoza. And we actually discussed it in Amsterdam, no, in Groningen, what was it, 3 years ago? And I'm still bugged by one of the same questions, and it's a little technical. So of course, a lot of this, both in the ethics and in letter 32, which is kind of like my Moby Dick, relies a lot technically. Like the real technical part is the quatinus and eatinus, right? It's how to capture this insofar as, and I'm worried about the metaphysical part of it. I'm worried, what does it mean, that respect? What's a respect for Spinoza? So I know this could open like another paper worth of discussion. So just if you could give me a brief, sketch of what do you think a respect is for Spinoza, and what's the relation between, because they cannot be parts, right? They cannot be parts of the human. So if they're not parts and they cannot be identical, because Spinoza does subscribe to Leibniz's law, what can they be?
Yeah, this is it's a good question. I deliberately limit by writing my paper, limit the quaternious and alternative sentences only used in the subject of individuation. So that means there are a bunch of different uses of quaternious and alternative in ethics. So and sometimes it's about conceptual distinction, but sometimes it's about real distinction, like in my case. So in my case, I think it's a kind of instrument to multiply the individuality as a relation or as a causal network or sets of different proportion of motion and rest, etc. So we can understand now what is the modal distinction in Spinoza. It's in one perspective real distinction, not real in the sense of the attributable distinction, but real distinction because I am I, you and you. But on the other hand, in a specific condition, we consist of one body. We construe one body, like the state is a composite body of people, but not in legal sense for Spinoza. No, in Tractatus Politicus and Tractatus Theologico Politicus, the state, the body politic is a legal one. It can be a legal one, but the most important thing is the power of multitude, the actual power of the multitude. Make the state individual. In this way, we can understand alternus quaternius in my paper, but there are other subjects using alternus quaternius clauses and their own purposes in Spinoza ethics. So I cannot say there is the coherence in using alternus quaternius.
Right. So no, just to clarify, because I think I missed a beat there, maybe the connection. So you're saying that in your idea, the quaternius alternus used to differentiate different states of individuation is real distinction? That's your thesis? All right.
Right.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right. We'll keep on going on this. But yeah, I'm getting a follow-up from Rafael. Is that correct? Yes. Rafael has a follow-up that the TTP seems to be using the law, specifically the concept of ratio vitae, to frame the individuation of a state as a whole. And then we have a lot of people saying goodbye, and indeed we should take this as a last occasion to thank Kim for this wonderful paper, for his patience during the Q&A, and for being our last speaker of 2021. So we will start soon with the 21-22 season. Just stay tuned on our channels on YouTube, on Facebook, and on the web page of the Vanderbilt Philosophy Department. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.